February 19th, 2015, Chicago's South Side. Barack Obama, President of the United States, a man whose political life was built block by block on Chicago's South Side, stands at a podium and signs a proclamation. He is designating a neighborhood a national monument, the first National Park Service unit in the history of Chicago. He reads from the document, First Planned Industrial Community in the United States, the protected boundaries, 103rd Street to 115th Street, Cottage Grove Avenue on the west, railroad tracks on the east, historic, preserved, federal. Nobody in that room knows what I'm about to tell you. For 40 years, that same ground, specifically the stretch between 103rd and 111th Street, Maryland Avenue to Cottage Grove, was, by one long circulating account of neighborhood power, the operating territory of a man named Daryl Abney. They called him Moose Man. The reason is not complicated. He was large, very large enough that when he walked into rooms, people made space, large enough that a 22-year-old Jeff Fort, already one of the most feared men in Chicago, took one look at a 15-year-old kid from the projects and handed him a seat at the table. We'll get there. Abney ran meetings in a basement, under a row house built in the 1880s, under a house that was not even in his name, it was his mother's. That house now sits inside the boundary of a federally protected National Historical Park. Think about that for a second. Genuinely. The United States government declared those streets historic. If the accounts are right about what ran out of that basement, and the people who were there say they are, the government did it without knowing his name, without knowing anything. This is his story. Daryl Reginald Abney is born April 6, 1954, in Arkansas. His family is part of the second wave of the Great Migration, black families loading everything they own and moving north, toward Chicago, toward factory jobs and better schools and a life not governed by the rules of the old South. The promised land, that was the phrase people used. They end up at Henry Horner Homes, near West Side, a mile and a half from the Loop, close enough to see the skyline from the upper floors, far enough that the skyline is basically decoration. The complex opens in 1957, 920 units, expanded by 1961 to 1,656, families stacked on top of families in a corridor of concrete between Damen and Wood, Lake Street running along the south edge, built on the western fringe of downtown, specifically because the land was cheap and nobody with political power lived anywhere near it. In the early years, it actually functions. And I know that's not the version of the story that gets told, but Henry Horner in the late 1950s is clean, maintained. The city invests barely, but it invests. Then the 1970s arrive, and the Chicago Housing Authority runs out of money for repairs, then keeps running out. Elevators break and stay broken for months. Radiators fail mid-January. And if you have never experienced the Chicago January, I will put it plainly. When the heat goes out in January, people die. Old people, sick people, small children. The hallways fill with things that should not be in hallways. Rats in the walls, roaches in every cabinet, stairwells that nobody walks alone after dark. This is where the city put its black families. Not by accident, by design. Daryl attends William H. Brown Elementary School. He is never small, big frame, big presence, a face that reads 3 years older than the birth certificate says. The neighborhood gives him a name early, Moose Man. His daughter Kat explains it with total sincerity. He looked like a big moose. That is the complete origin story of a name that will mean something on two different sides of Chicago for the next 50 years. Kid looked like a moose. Streets ran with it. Years later, people who knew him, Stone, folk, rival, neighbor, were asked what they remembered. The answer came back the same from every direction. Not a bad word ever said. Kind-hearted, a man who loved his family. I want you to hold that, because everything that comes next, the organization, the territory, the machine, it was built by that man, the same one. 1968, April 4th. Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis. Within hours, the west side of Chicago, including the streets right around Henry Horner, erupts. Buildings burn. National Guard rolls through. The neighborhood is under military occupation for days. Daryl Abney is 13 years old, 2 days from his 14th birthday, watching the block he grew up on turned into a battlefield. Madison Street, the commercial heart of the near west side, where black-owned businesses had anchored the neighborhood for decades, burns that week. It is never rebuilt. That same year, he pulls a crew together at Paulina and Washington. His daughter, Kat, is direct about why. Her father built the group because of racial violence. White kids, Hispanic kids, attacking black teenagers in the surrounding streets. The near west side in 1968 is a neighborhood in violent transition, and nobody in authority is stepping in. So Daryl Abney steps in. The crew calls itself the Paulina Gangsters. Home base, 1625 West Washington Boulevard. A corner, a few boys, a decision. It starts in self-defense, in a burning city, under a name that sounds like exactly what it is. Kids from Paulina Street who decided to protect their own. What it becomes is something else entirely. 1969. Jeff Fort is 22 years old. Let me say that again, 22. And he already runs the most powerful street organization in the history of Chicago. Not the police, not City Hall, not the Chicago outfit, which has been operating since before either of these men were born. Jeff Fort, 22 years old, 5,000 members, 21 generals, the Black P. Stone Nation. The Fort story starts a decade earlier, a juvenile correctional facility called St. Charles, where he meets Eugene Bull Hairston, two kids who decide to build something. Over the following decade, they build a confederation of 21 formerly independent Chicago street gangs, 5,000 members, all of it answering upward to Fort. He renames it in 1968, the Black P. Stone Nation. The following year, the federal government hands him a $1 million grant to stop being Fort. He takes the money. He remains Fort. Now here is what made him genuinely different. He was an architect, not just muscle, not just fear. He did not put people on his council because they frightened him. He put them there because they could build things and hold them together under pressure. Can you build and can you hold? 1969, the Macketeers, a crew associated with Abney's Paulina Gangsters, come into contact with the BPSN. Fort meets Daryl Abney. He is 15 years old. Fort puts him on the council. Think about what the council actually is. The main 21, generals of 21 separate organizations, men with years in the streets, territory, history, the kind of resume you don't put on paper. And Fort looks at a teenager from the West Side Projects, a kid who carries himself like someone who has already decided everything, and gives him a seat at that table. You do not do that from sentiment. You do it because the kid brought something real. A West Side foothold, a crew that was already organized, already disciplined, already running like a proper operation and not just a corner group. What Abney had built on Paulina Street at 15 was architecture. Fort, at 22, recognized it on sight. That seat on the council was not ceremonial. It came with the protection of 5,000 members, access to supply lines, the institutional backing that turns a corner crew into something durable. Abney walked into 1969 as the leader of a West Side corner group. He walked out as a general of the Black P. Stone Nation. When the Macketeers formally fold into the BPSN in 1969, the name crystallizes. Not the Paulina Gangsters anymore, the Gangster Stones. It sounds like it was always called that. It sounds like it was always going to exist. It wasn't inevitable. It was a transaction between two unusually clear-eyed young men. A teenager brought a West Side operation to a man running 5,000 people, and the man handed the teenager a seat at the most powerful table in Chicago street history. Both of them got exactly what they needed. Over the years that follow, the Gangster Stones become the most organized Black P. Stone faction on the West Side. Other Stone groups fade and fracture. The Gangster Stones remain organized, expanding, deeply embedded in Henry Horner. That kind of durability does not come from luck. It comes from the person at the top knowing exactly what they are doing. Jeff Fort saw that at 15 in a city that never wrote Daryl Abney's name down once. What he could not have known, what nobody at that table could have known, is that 7 years later, Fort would ask Abney to follow him somewhere much further in, and the answer Abney gave would determine the rest of both their lives. 1970. Daryl Abney is 16 years old. His mother buys a house, 104th Street and Corliss Avenue, Pullman, south side of Chicago, a different world from Henry Horner, geographically and historically. The house is a row house, built in the 1880s by the Pullman Palace Car Company as worker housing, Queen Anne style, brick facade, a narrow footprint in a row of identical narrow footprints running the length of Corliss Avenue. George Pullman commissioned this entire neighborhood in the 1880s, hired an architect named Solon Spencer Beeman to design it down to the last row house. It was a model company town. He owned the buildings, the streets, the stores, the church. He owned everything his workers touched. The idea was that if you controlled the environment, you controlled the people in it. Daryl Abney understood that logic better than most. He had been running on a version of it since he was 14 years old on Paulina Street. There is something almost poetic and deeply unsettling about a black man from a housing project setting up operations inside a neighborhood that a railroad baron built specifically on the principle of total environmental control. Different century, different power structure, same logic. The house goes in his mother's name, not his. According to his daughter Kat, this was deliberate. A man running a street organization does not want property records tying him to a fixed address. He took care of the house and his mother as if it was entirely his, which in every way that mattered, it was. Family memory holds that the basement became the meeting room. He would marry twice, father 6 children. There is a version of Daryl Abney that exists only in that register. Husband, father, the man who kept his mother's house. That version of him is in no public record either. Both of his lives, the one above ground and the one below, left almost the same trace. And according to his daughter Kat, there is something else about that basement. A passage, a corridor running from the backyard through the property's original infrastructure, a remnant of the underground service system built beneath Pullman's factory complex in the 1880s, a tunnel leading out to the row houses on Maryland Avenue, the kind of detail that sounds invented, and maybe, if you want to be strict about it, still needs a second source. But Pullman's 1880s infrastructure does include exactly the kind of service corridors Kat describes, and the people from those streets don't dispute it. If Kat's account is right, and there's no reason to think she's wrong about her own father's house, then this story has been underground from the first line. The man spent his entire life operating out of sight, and if the family memory holds, his headquarters was literally underground. He does not leave Henry Horner behind. This matters. Abney is not retreating to the south side. He is expanding to it. He leaves Henry June Bug Brown running the fortress on the west side. The machine at Henry Horner keeps turning. Abney builds a second base in Pullman, two anchors, two sides of the city, one organization operating in both directions from a man whose name appears on no deed anywhere. When he arrives in Pullman, the Supreme Gangsters, the crew that would eventually merge into what Chicago knows today as the Gangster Disciples, control the ground around Corliss High School, Gately Park Stadium, and North Pullman. Abney does not negotiate. He challenges them directly and physically. The Gangster Stones fight for the territory and take it. Within a short time, they control Corliss High School. They run Gately Park, North Pullman from 103rd to 111th Street, Maryland Avenue to Cottage Grove. All of it Gangster Stone ground. The house at 104th and Corliss becomes what people will call the Mecca, the 10-4. Operations running from a basement above a tunnel already 100 years old under a house in his mother's name. 1976. Jeff Fort gets out of federal prison. He comes out changed, adopts an Islamic framework, renames the organization the El Rukns, acquires a building on South Drexel that everyone calls the Fort. He rebuilds his inner circle from the ground up, and then he reaches out to Daryl Abney. The offer is direct. Bring the Gangster Stones in. Come fully inside the El Rukn structure. We have always been family. Make it official. Abney says no, or close enough to no. He does it carefully because Fort was not a man you refuse carelessly, and because the respect between them was real, not strategic, not performed, but the kind of mutual recognition between two people who each understood what the other had built. Abney says he wants to stay family, says the Gangster Stones will remain close without folding in, finds the exact words that preserve the relationship without surrendering the independence. What he is actually saying is, I am not going where you are going. He does not know yet where Fort is going, but something in him already knows not to follow. Daryl Abney is in Pullman. The Gangster Stones are at Henry Horner. One man, two anchors, operating under one name. That is the machine he built. Henry Horner is the western edge of it, a building they called the Fortress. By the 1980s, under Henry Junebug Brown, the Gangster Stones control most of the older buildings in the Henry Horner complex. What they build there is what investigators at the time call the most sophisticated drug market in the complex. Not just the most violent, the most organized, structured, run with the kind of internal discipline that keeps an operation alive through wars, arrests, and leadership transitions. Retired Chicago police officer Juan Martinez served Henry Horner from 1989 to 1992. He said it plainly, and I am quoting directly from his account. Gangs, they pretty much controlled everything there. They controlled drugs, they controlled women, they controlled liquor, they controlled cigarettes, they controlled anything and everything vice-related. Everything, not most things, everything. The crack epidemic is accelerating across Chicago's west side. The margins get bigger, the violence gets worse, the turnover in human life gets faster. Families trapped in deteriorating towers, trying to raise children between the operation below and the broken infrastructure above. The city that built Henry Horner and then stopped maintaining it has no plan for any of this. Meanwhile, Jeff Fort's world is collapsing. 1983, drug trafficking, 13 years. 1987, conspiracy to commit terrorism on behalf of Libya, 80 years. 1988, a murder he ordered in 1981, 75 more years. 13 plus 80 plus 75, 168 years total. The man who handed Abney a council seat at 15 is in the federal system for the rest of his natural life. The organizational umbrella that sheltered the Gangster Stones dissolves from the top down. Every El Rukn general goes down with Fort. The Gangster Stones, who answered to no one above them, are untouched. Abney said no in 1976. That quiet refusal, the one he wrapped in careful words about staying family, is now a firewall. He did not know it would work this way, but it did. 1988. Brown goes to prison on drug distribution charges. 3 years. The fortress keeps running without him. That is how embedded the structure is. But the wars are getting worse. This is what Abney built, a machine durable enough to survive the arrest of the man running it. It is also a machine he is no longer inside. Daryl Abney is at the Mecca, running the 10-4. The West Side machine operates in his name, but he is not there. That is the design. That is also what makes what happens next possible. 1991, the Four Corner Hustlers push into Henry Horner, new leadership, aggressive, territorial, wanting the same ground the Gangster Stones have held for 2 decades. The traveling vice lords follow. Multiple factions, overlapping turf, a drug market large enough to justify the body count. The people who actually live there absorb all of it. March 1995, Brown is out of prison. The Chicago Housing Authority has just announced the start of demolition. The buildings are coming down, phase by phase, and Brown makes a decision that ends everything. A man named Gaddis Johnson owes drug money. Brown wants to find Johnson's brother, who owes more. Brown, along with his wife and 2 others, takes Gaddis Johnson inside the fortress. They hold him for 2 days. What happened during those 2 days is in the court record. The details are documented. I am not going to narrate them. What matters for this story is what happened next. Johnson escapes when they are transporting him to be killed. He runs to an elevated train station and calls his family. February 20th, 1998. Henry June Bug. Brown stands in a Cook County courtroom. The judge calls him a street gang leader, a habitual criminal, and an incredibly dangerous human being. Natural life imprisonment. The person who testifies against him at trial is his wife. On his way out of the courtroom, Brown pulls down his pants and moons the prosecutor. That is his last public act in that courtroom. The legal proceedings would continue for years. Appeals, reversals, a sentence reduction, and in 2019, June Bug Brown walked out. But the empire at Henry Horner ended in 1998 when the buildings came down and the man who ran them walked into the system. In Pullman, Abney absorbs it. The West Side machine, built from a corner on Paulina Street, carried across 3 decades of wars and arrests and leadership transitions, is gone. What remains is the South Side, the 10-4, and a man whose name never appeared once in that Cook County courtroom. August 1995. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development takes over Henry Horner. The buildings start coming down. Cranes, dust, the fortress, gone. The towers that Daryl Abney grew up in, that June Bug Brown ran an empire from, that a retired police officer described as a place where gangs controlled everything vice-related, gone. Phase 1 removes 466 of the 1,765 units in the complex. Phase 2 follows. The last high-rise comes down in 2005. The last building, a mid-rise, in 2008. 13 years of demolition. I want you to sit with that number, not the buildings, the time. There had been a lawsuit. 1991, the Henry Horner Mothers Guild and residents filed a class action against the Chicago Housing Authority for neglect, the rats, the broken elevators, the radiators that failed in January. In 1995, the parties reached a consent decree. Every Horner family would receive replacement housing. For every unit demolished, one would be built. Here is what actually happened. 1,765 units became 622 public housing units in the replacement development. More than 1,000 families scattered across the city, no replacement unit waiting. The organization scatters with them. That is always how it works. You cannot demolish a building and leave the life that organized itself around it intact. Both things come down together. After Brown goes to prison in 98, the Gangster Stones begin fracturing. Original leadership gone. Younger members without the structure. Abney and Brown spent decades building start-making individual decisions, some to the four-corner hustlers, some elsewhere. The Pullman anchor holds for a while. The 10-4, 104th, and Corliss becomes the gathering point for displaced members from the West Side. Through the late 90s and into the 2000s, Pullman is where the Gangster Stones are strongest. Then that starts changing too. By the mid-2000s, portions of North Pullman begin flipping, members moving into the Black Peace Stones under a faction called London Town. The organization Abney founded in 1968, carried across the city from a corner on Paulina Street, is slowly folding back into the larger structure it always technically belonged to. Daryl Abney fades from public record. No major racketeering case turned up bearing his name. No RICO indictment on record. He appears in the margins of court documents. A name, a reference, never the center of anything. No major headline. The Chicago Crime Commission did record his name once. Their gang classification book listed him as El Rukin, the organization he had carefully, specifically said no to 30 years earlier. Even when the state managed to write his name down, they wrote it wrong. This is where the logic of his life turns against itself. He built power through invisibility. No paper trail, no records, no property in his name. That invisibility kept him free for 50 years. It also meant that when the physical territory changed, when the buildings came down and the members scattered, there was nothing left of him in any archive. The tool that protected him became the tool of his erasure. His prison stints, whatever the charges, however many years, ends sometime in the 2000s. He moves to Robbins, Illinois, a small suburb south of Chicago. He has diabetes. He is no longer running anything. The buildings are rubble. The organization is fragmenting. The man who built it is in Robbins. And somewhere, a proclamation is being drafted. February 19th, 2015. Barack Obama stands at a podium and designates Pullman a national monument. We have been here before. This is where the story started. But now we know what he doesn't. The protected boundaries run from 103rd Street to 115th Street, Cottage Grove Avenue on the west, railroad tracks on the east. The Gangster Stones under Daryl Abney controlled 103rd to 111th Street, Maryland Avenue to Cottage Grove. The overlap is nearly complete. The federal government has declared Mooseman's Ground historically significant without knowing his name, without knowing what happened in that basement, without knowing anything. The row houses on Corliss Avenue, built by George Pullman in the 1880s, rented to factory workers, later the operational base of a street organization that ran two sides of Chicago for 4 decades, are now contributing structures in a federally protected historic district. The underground passage Kat described, running from the backyard out to Maryland Avenue, sits within a neighborhood now protected through federal historic designation, whether anyone in the Park Service knows it is there or not. I genuinely do not know what to do with that, so I just leave it there. Jeff Fort in 2015 is 68 years old. He has been at ADX Florence, the federal supermax in Colorado, since 2006. 6 by 9 foot cell, near total isolation. The man who handed Daryl Abney a council seat at 15, who ran 5,000 people at 22, who coordinated a terrorism plot from a prison cell in Texas. That man cannot see the sky. In 2026, Jeff Fort is 79 years old, still at ADX Florence. One man ends up in a supermax in Colorado. The other ends up in Robbins, Illinois, outside any official record. Neither man's world survived intact, but one of them got to watch the demolition from the outside. That is not nothing. 2019, Daryl Reginald Abney dies at 65 years old in Robbins, Illinois, Diabetes. No story in the Tribune, no obituary in the Sun-Times, no federal case unsealed, no Wikipedia page, no documentary crew. His daughter writes one sentence on Instagram. My father, Mooseman, yes, he is a legend. I miss him dearly. That is everything the public record offered up. The Gangster Stones are still active at 103rd to 111th Street in Pullman. Same ground, same zip code, inside the boundary of a national historical park. The federal government declared his ground a national monument in 2015. By 2022, it had been redesignated a national historical park. They did not know whose ground it was. Maybe nobody outside those streets ever did. The government preserved his ground without knowing it was his. That is not irony. That is the proof. A man can build an empire so far underground that the state itself becomes its guardian and never knows it. That is the thing about underground history. It goes down when the man who made it does.